In this question, we're asked to prove that n squared minus n is never an odd number, given that n can be any integer, such that n is greater than 1. Well, to prove that n squared minus n is never an odd number, we can use algebra to find n squared minus n when n is odd and when n is even. Let's start by finding n squared minus n when n is an odd number. Now algebraically, we can write an odd number as 2n plus 1 or 2n minus 1. We know that 2n must be an even number because anything multiplied by 2 is even. And so 2n plus 1 or 2n minus 1 is a number before or after an even number, which means that 2n plus 1 or 2n minus 1 is always an odd number. Let's say that n is 2n plus 1. And so n squared minus n is equal to 2n plus 1 all squared minus 2n plus 1. And so 2n plus 1 all squared would be equal to 4n squared plus 4n plus 1, and then we have the minus brackets 2n plus 1 at the very end. Now it's important to be careful of our brackets. If we have minus and then brackets 2n plus 1, this becomes minus 2n minus 1. Because looking at our writing in green, we can imagine that minus brackets 2n plus 1 is actually minus 1 multiplied by the whole expression 2n plus 1, and so minus 1 multiplied by the 2n would be minus 2n, and minus 1 multiplied by 1 would be minus 1. So now when we simplify this, we'll get 4n squared, and then 4n minus 2n, which is equal to 2n, and then 1 take away 1, which is equal to 0. And so simplifying this, we're left with 4n squared plus 2n. Now factorising the 2 out, we can say that 4n squared plus 2n is equal to 2 multiplied by 2n squared plus 1. Now since we've been able to factorise the 2 out, we've proven that 4n squared plus 2n is a multiple of 2. And so if it's a multiple of 2, it must be an even number. And so we've now proven that if n is odd, n squared minus n is an even number. Well, now we need to do the same thing, but if n is an even number. Well, algebraically, we can say that an even number is equal to 2n. And so if n is even, n squared minus n is equal to 2n all squared minus 2n. Now simplifying this, 2n all squared is equal to 4n squared, and then minus 2n is 4n squared minus 2n. We can factorise the 2 out, and we can say that 4n squared minus 2n is 2 multiplied by 2n squared minus 1. Like we said before, this expression has been multiplied by 2. If it's a multiple of 2, we know that 4n squared minus 2n is an even number. And so it's important that we have a conclusive statement at the end of our working out, to say that if n is odd, n squared minus n is even, and if n is even, n squared minus n is also even. And so n squared minus n is always an even number. And so we've now proven that n squared minus n is never an odd number. Now this question is worth 2 marks. We get 1 mark for finding the value of n squared minus n when n is odd and when n is even. And then we get the 2nd mark for factorising the expressions that we get. And so when n is odd, when we factorise the 2 out, we find that n squared minus n is 2 multiplied by 2n squared plus 1. And if n is even, when we factorise the 2 out, we'll find that n squared minus n is equal to 2 multiplied by 2n squared minus 1. And so by factorising the 2 out, we were able to prove that n squared minus n is an even number, regardless of whether n is odd or if n is even. And so we've now achieved the full 2 marks needed in this question.